Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have, I thought Trump had sworn off foreign aid, posted by Tom 13, and that's cross post they made from the behind to the Behind Bastard subreddit. And so the post says, "Sorry about your health currents." The headline from the New York Times: U.S. pledges support for Argentina's economy in a Trump ally in crisis. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said all options are under consideration to help President Javier Milei. And personally, I do like Milei and what he's doing in Argentina in regards to libertarian economics. With that being said, personally, my take on foreign aid to Argentina is the exact same as it is for Israel, Ukraine, or any other country. I think if people do want to voluntarily send money to another country, they should be able to, but they shouldn't be forced to do so if they don't want to. And that's very much how I feel about the U.S. giving money to Argentina. I personally am very sympathetic to Milei and his ideas for the country. But personally, I don't think it's the U.S.'s job to get involved over there. Same Israel and Argentina. I know this isn't getting militarily involved, but still, any money getting thrown over there is something that could be used over here. I think that's very important to remember as well. Personally, if it were up to me, we'd have voluntary taxation where, if people wanted to earmark their money to go to Argentina or Israel or Ukraine or any other country, they should be able to. But that's not what we have currently, and I think I would argue that since it isn't, we shouldn't be sending any taxpayer money overseas because ultimately people, I think the vast majority of Americans would much prefer their taxpayer dollars be used inside the country rather than outside the country. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have an official posting from the White House TikTok account posted by Dr. 07, and they link to the official post from the White House TikTok account about how it's a video of ICE getting everyone, and they're doing it to the first iteration of the Pokemon theme song, "Gotta Catch 'Em All." And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that. I think that's kind of in bad taste, but that's kind of the White House's whole MO. It's pretty much been Trump's whole MO since he entered the raid for the first time back in 2015. I'm going to be the shitposting president, pretty much he said, and he's pretty much been consistent on that front for the past decade. I would say, if he wants to have the White House make the official White House TikTok account make shit post about, oh, we're gonna play a bunch of videos of ICE arresting people to the Pokemon theme song. I personally think that's kind of in bad taste. But he's very much the shit posting president. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for it. But ultimately, people will justify what they justify. And yeah, I'm sure if it was a leftist shitposting president, Reddit would love it and think it's the greatest thing ever. But since it's not a leftist, Reddit thinks it's the worst thing ever. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Here's an Idea, posted by Straight Platform 59, and they said, "I think the only way at this point to push back against MAGA is for all of us, the rest of us, to openly come together. Personally, I think the Democratic Party needs to rebuild in the same way from the ground up to be welcome ousted Republicans that want to stand up against Trump but cannot due to the potential damages to their political career. At least the rest of us as citizens ought to openly come together to be the beacon of unity and democracy in this country. I think this is the only way we reverse the damage that's been done and reject what is coming. Stand together, not with anger in our hearts, but with hope, tolerance, and courage. We as a country are stronger than Trump, and if only we would realize the power we have together and the necessity of using it instead of being silent and thinking this will just end in 4 years. It will not. Set aside what divides us and embrace what unites us. Reach across the aisle, shake your brother's sister's hand, and do something. Democracy is worth it." And yeah, personally, I think that's just kind of overly idealistic. At this point, Trump's clearly, I do agree that, this isn't going to end in 4 years. Trump might go away in 4 years, but, political toxicity definitely isn't going away at this point, especially with all these social media echo chambers and people constantly jerking themselves off. And yeah, personally, I think if you want to have unity, I think that's fine. But it's interesting. A lot of people say, "Oh, we need unity. We need to turn down the temperature." Are the same ones who go, "Anyone who sends all is a Nazi, fascist, Hitler, etc., etc." And that just goes to show you, it's all about turning down temperature. Unless it's for the out group, then suddenly it's completely fine to label them whatever you want to label them, and it's completely justified. And yeah, that personally, I think at this point, the only way out, I would say, is for national divorce. We got to start breaking up the country, and because increasingly it's clear that Americans simply have different values from one another. So we need to have if everyone wants to enforce their values on someone else, only people will justify that's right. But I think increasingly we just need to break up the country as much as possible, maybe into millions upon millions of countries. Like microstates where each individual household is a country, like kind of like the Molossi out in Nevada or Slowjamistan out in California. Ultimately, people. I think the idea of the country is kind of outdated in a world where everyone is increasingly connected to each other through social media. And so I personally would say, ultimately, this isn't arguing for like world government or anything, but we need individual governance rather than forced collectivist governance. People want more voluntary collectives, that's fine, but forced collectivism definitely isn't the answer, and I think the past decade has very much shown that. Next, we have Google admits censorship under Biden, promises to end bans of YouTube accounts of thousands of Americans censored for political speech, posted from judiciary.house.gov, posted by JStocksQQQ, and they added, this is huge, and of course this one's being the only 21% upvoted on Reddit, and I posted it to the Libertarian Party USA subreddit as well. Where is it? There it is. And I added, how are the leftist agitators here supposed to react now to pressuring private companies to censor is seen as a bad thing because of Kimmel? And it's interesting, Reddit is, they think when Trump censors Kimmel, Trump and his government pressure ABC to censor Kimmel, it's the worst thing ever. But this is either going to be swept under the rug or justified, saying, oh, misinformation isn't free speech. And that just goes to show you, increasingly, both major parties don't care about free speech. They just want to make any dissent at all illegal. And yeah, you gotta stand up for free speech even if you don't care for it. I don't really care for Reddit and how much of a giant circle jerk it is when it comes to being progressive. But I don't usually argue for them to be banned or censored entirely. Even though I would argue it's more than justified at this point because it's pretty much become progressive.alqaeda.com. But ultimately, I think the libertarian position is we need maximum freedom of speech, and increasingly you don't see that from either major party. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is natural to manure. Thomas Jefferson and Shays' Rebellion, 1786 to 1787, posted by Fear the Creeper, and they said, this is the story that started with one of the first U.S. government financial scandals. I apologize for this being so long, but there is a lot to unpack here. At the end of the U.S. Revolutionary War, many veterans had received little pay during the war, found themselves being cheated out of their back pay on by Congress or the Confederation. This was after the war, before the Constitution, so the federal government was quite different than the later United States government. Those veterans who had been farmers had financial difficulties from being away fighting the British instead of growing crops, and were counting on that back pay. In 1780, Daniel Shays resigned from the army unpaid and went home to find himself in a court for non-payment of debts that his family incurred while he was gone. The merchants who had the debts insisted on being paid in hard currency, backed by gold. The back pay would have given him the hard currency, but the federal government cheated him. Alas, rural New England at the time was largely barter economy. The farmers could easily barter their crops, but pretty much nobody was willing to pay in hard currency instead of barter. If only the government would pay Shay what they owed him, he would be able to pay his creditors. Massachusetts Governor John Hancock had, during his time in office, refused to vigorously act to collect delinquent taxes and accept a value of paper currency as payment. When Hancock left office, James Bowdoin, one of the merchants who insisted on hard currency, was elected. He immediately raised taxes and stepped up collection of back taxes and all in hard currency. John Adams observed that these levies were heavier than the people could bear. Tax collectors started going to the courts and obtaining judgments authorizing property seizures. The farmers petitioned the state legislature, but no action was taken, presumably because powerful merchants opposed it. So the farmers rebelled and shut down the courts. Bowdoin called out the Worcester County militia to suppress the rebellion, but the militia refused to turn out, and it was composed mainly of men sympathetic to the protesters. In other counties, the militia were able to keep the courts open, and the protesters started calling for secession. Samuel Adams invoked a riot act and passed a resolution suspending habeas corpus so the authorities could legally keep people in jail indefinitely without trial. Adams also proposed that any rebellions against the federal government should be punished by death, but the proposal did not pass. Rebel leaders spoke of smashing the tyrannical government of Massachusetts, descended when federal troops rushed the rebellion. Thomas Jefferson argued argued that the occasional rebellion serves to reserve freedoms. In response to the state's rebellion, Jefferson wrote, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time for the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is this natural manure." Writing about today's rebellion, Thomas Jefferson said, "The future inhabitants of the Atlantic Mississippi states will be our sons. We leave them in distinct but bordering establishments. We think that we will see their happiness in their union. We wish it. Events may prove it otherwise, and if they see their interest in separation, why should we take side for Atlantic rather than our Mississippi descendants? If it is the elder and the younger son differ, and God bless them both and keep them in union, if it be for the good, but separate them if it be for the better." Emphasis in original. Source letter from Thomas Jefferson to John C. Breckinridge, August 12, 1803. Because of the state's rebellion, there was talk about adding explicit, "If you join the Union, you can never leave," language with the new Constitution, but it didn't make it in. The question was eventually settled during using the time-honored "My Army Won, So I Get My Way" method, first during the Whiskey Rebellion and later during the Civil War. Yet you still hear loose talk about various states leaving the Union in 2025. Would the original 13 colonies ever have been formed a Union if they were told to start they could never leave and would be invaded if they tried? It's an interesting question. And I would agree with all that. Personally, I think it's good that the Constitution doesn't have any "if you join the Union you could never leave" language in it, but I do think the founding fathers should have been more clear about secession and if states should be able to secede or not in the Constitution. I think that's one of their greatest failures in regards to the Constitution. A lot of people will say, "So what about slavery?" And I say, I would agree with slavery, but that's definitely one that's brought up a lot. I think secession is probably an even bigger failure, though, because if you join the Union, you're pretty much forced to be there forever. And I think the Libertarian position is, any state should be able to secede whenever it feels like it, and to support secession down to the individual level. And I think that's very much, if I ever run for governor of Pennsylvania, which I'm definitely planning on it someday, I'll very much put in my campaign. Personally, I think this country is a slowly but surely sinking ship, and I think it's better to get out while you still can, and that's very much my take on secession and in regards to Pennsylvania and the rest of the Union. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump administration's troops inferred U.S. to enforce the will of the president from Beltway.news, posted by Donald Key, and that's crosswords from the Law subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for it, but I personally think this is just political theater. I think the troops are just going to, they're really like the National Guard, they're just going to stand around and pick up trash rather than actually go after crime. But ultimately, people will justify, the good state will justify whatever wants to justify. They have the legal monopoly and use of force to pretty much be unopposed when it comes to that. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Dallas ICE shooting from Fox4News.com, posted by Flimsy Al 5563, and they added, "Looks like a sniper took out 3 detainees before taking his own life." And yeah, personally, I wouldn't be surprised if this was a Redditor who was trying to aim for the ICE agents but accidentally shot the detainees instead. It seems very much, it looks like, I think that they had engraved on the bullets like anti-ICE and all that. So yeah, I definitely wouldn't be surprised if this was a Redditor, and it's just to show you why, Reddit's pretty much progressive.com at this point. They're like, "Oh, we need to turn down temperature," but anyone who dissents at all is literally a Nazi. And I'm sure if it was the ICE agents who were killed, Reddit would be celebrating this to the max. But of course, they have to disavow it since the detainees were the ones who were killed instead. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump threatens Jimmy Kimmel again and destroys MAGA's entire defense from NewRepublic.com, posted by Donald Key. And yeah, personally, I think Trump shouldn't be threatening Jimmy Kimmel. The Libertarian position is, let Jimmy Kimmel be irrelevant. He pretty much was irrelevant before Trump started talking about him constantly. And yeah, personally, I think if I were Trump, if I were him, I'd go after Reddit instead, because that's pretty much just a platform of a million Jimmy Kimmels. That wouldn't be very good either, but a platform like Reddit is far, far more influential these days than a TV show like Jimmy Kimmel. Trump's very much in his boomer mentality. He still thinks TV is the most relevant thing in the world. Well, increasingly, social media and the internet are much more relevant, but he's too old to realize that, it seems. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Massey says he has the signatures to force U.S. vote on releasing Epstein files from KentuckyLantern.com, posted by Donald Key. And yeah, personally, I think that's good. But as I said in the past, ultimately the Epstein files, I don't think anyone will accept the Epstein files at this point. Because they don't go after enough people on the other side or something, and people will just cope and move on to the next thing. And that's very much what politics is at this point. It's everything's supposedly earth-shattering, but in reality, nothing ever really happens, and people always just move on to whatever the next thing is. Next, we have GOP politician's daughter calls him total loser after Netanyahu visit from NewRepublic.com, posted by Donald Key. And yeah, personally, I would agree with that. But just because someone 20-something on TikTok calls her dad a total loser isn't kind of the headline when I think Reddit thinks it is. If you want to call your dad a total loser, that's fine. But I definitely don't think it's big enough for its own headline and story. But of course, Reddit, and it's pretty much like a lot of people think that Reddit says, oh, MAG is all about we own the libs. Well, Reddit's pretty much all about we own the cons at this point, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have false U.S. government buying Argentina's government debt from, and that's a self-post made by Historical Note 6758, this topic hasn't been mentioned yet in the subreddit, and so I thought I'd be the first one to mention it. And yeah, I talked about this earlier, but I do think, if taxpayers do want to voluntarily send money to buy up Argentina's debt, I think they should be able to. But right now, under forced collectivism, I don't think people should be forced to send aid to any other countries, and that includes Argentina. Even if I do personally like the government there, under Milei, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have former friends share thoughts on ICE facility shooter from KenKiltLippenstein.com, posted by Narco Federation. They added, Klippenstein interviews former friends and acquaintances of the shooter, and while the Trump admin and FBI are busy tripping over their dicks, working the conclusions backwards from their attempts at cracking down on the left and blaming them all for all acts of domestic violence, there seems to be similarities to Kirk shooting, like they're trying to set a trend. Edgelord shootings steeped in 4chan nihilist meme culture, Joaquin Phoenix, Joker-esque, not real ideological motivations, more like wanting everyone to watch everyone implode. And yeah, personally, I guess I would kind of agree with that. I definitely do think you have a lot of nihilistic culture on Reddit, but they said 4chan for a reason, because 4chan's very much the outgroup, the more cons, well, Reddit's very much the in-group, to be more libs, so you can't criticize Reddit. And yeah, I definitely wouldn't be surprised if this shooter had a Reddit account just like the rest of them, but I guess we'll have to wait and see on that front. And that's my thoughts on that issue. So I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.